Welcome to Big Questions. Do keep coming in, grab a sandwich and a seat. My name is V, and a really, really warm welcome here this lunchtime. Big Questions is a space to ask, discuss, and investigate some of those big questions we have about life, its meaning, and the claims of Jesus. And this week, we're going to be looking at whether the accounts of his life are historically reliable. So soon we'll be hearing a short talk, and after that, there'll be some space for questions. Please text in your questions to the number here on the lectern, and you'll see it on the pillars as well. We'd really love to hear what you think. We want to have a discussion. It's great to have Dr. Dirk Jongkind here as our speaker. Dirk is the academic vice principal at Tyndale House, and he's a fellow at St Edmunds College here in Cambridge, and he specialises in the transmission of the New Testament texts. So it's really great to have you here today, Dirk. Over to you.
Well, thank you for a welcome. And of course, you should sort of reserve any applause for afterwards, because I may actually give you a question which you haven't had before at all in your life, which is sort of nice, no? Rather than answering a big question, I'm going to raise a big question for you. I mean, in a sense, we are living in quite exciting times, no? Said the old man of nearly half a century. The whole world is now accessible through my phone. Information is digitized, shared, and stored as tiny electromagnetic, what's the correct term? Bobs, or whatever it is. So everything now is basically online, which leads to very exciting possibilities. Because now it is easier than ever to rewrite history. I mean, identities are easier forged than ever before. And facts are no longer facts. I mean, just imagine the sort of sheer possibility of writing an intelligent, small computer program that just goes through every digitally stored database there is and changes your third to a first. I mean, it is possible. Okay, I'm not encouraging you, but in theory, it is possible. So facts are no longer as much facts as they used to be, perhaps. I mean, money is not the same as it used to be. It is now just some digits in your bank account, but how many people are walking around with wads of cash? Now, since we tend to read the past through the categories of our own experience, there is a legitimate question when it comes to the 4 Gospels you find in your New Testament. I mean, what if those 4 Gospels are the result of some creative rewriting by the church at one point? I mean, and since most of us get our historical knowledge through Netflix these days, what if the Da Vinci Code, which you probably have seen but not read, I mean, what if the Da Vinci Code was right after all, that somewhere in the 4th century there was some meeting of lots of bishops who were fighting over which books should be in the Bible and what the message of the New Testament should be. So what do Christians have to say in answer to such a narrative? Has the text of the New Testament, as it was originally written, perhaps been sanitized, or a word that was very popular in the days of the Second Iraq War, has the text perhaps been sexed up to make Jesus more God than he actually was, or that the first disciples proclaimed him to be? Could this have happened, I mean, just play with the thought for a moment, could this have happened without a trace? That's the first question. Well, okay, granted that everything was copied by hand and it was the time sort of when you could not send out a virus to change everything. Perhaps not. Perhaps it should have left traces. Now comes the killer blow. When you compare all the old Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. So Greek is the language in the original language of the New Testament. When you compare those old Greek manuscripts, there are indeed tons of differences between them. I mean, we're not talking about 5 or 10 differences. No, we're literally talking about thousands of differences, to such a degree that nobody actually has counted them all, but sort of the estimate, the best estimate at the moment, is that there are roughly 500,000 differences in total between the various manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. And to put this in perspective, 500,000 differences on a text that is only 135,000 words long. And of course, you can pick up a random Bible. I mean, on your table, there's a Gospel of Luke, and feel free to take it away. But if you go to Luke chapter 10, or Luke, start of Luke 11, it's on page 37. There you can see that they even are struggling to hide the fact that there are differences between manuscripts. On page 37, look at the footnotes. The second footnote. Some manuscripts, and then you get a different reading from what there is in the main text. Third footnote. Some manuscripts, our Father in heaven, instead of just Father. Then the fourth footnote. Some manuscripts, and then add, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So even an average Christian Bible will tell you indeed that there are lots of variants and differences. So this may be all evidence that the Bible indeed has been changed in the course of the textual transmission, because these are the sort of typical things you would expect to be there. So a summary of the big question then. What do I have to say to the fact that all those differences between the manuscripts of the New Testament testify to a systematic rewriting carried out by the church? Or to put it differently, how can you claim to know Jesus from the Gospels when those Gospels have been changed in the course of hundreds of years of copying? So that is the question. Now, some of the popular answers, and I have given these answers in the past, you may have given these answers, you may have had this answer when you asked the question. First answer would be, there are so many manuscripts and so many old manuscripts, therefore we know what the text is. There's something unsatisfying about this answer. And I'll tell you what. The problem is, first of all, there are not that many old manuscripts. So if we say cut-off year of 800, and we're looking at the first 800 years of our era, well, then at most there are about 300 manuscripts. But only one of them contains the complete New Testament. All the others vary from tiny snippets of papyrus to a couple of books or 4 Gospels, or there are 2 or 3 that contain the New Testament and a couple of chapters missing here and there because pages have fallen out. There's only one complete Greek New Testament from before 800. So the many manuscripts argument is perhaps not the best one. And in addition, the many manuscripts, that's actually part of the problem. Because it is because there are many manuscripts that you get those many differences. So perhaps many manuscripts, many variants, perhaps we can do better. Another answer, which is slightly suspect, is this one. You may have heard that one. Even though there are problems in the New Testament text, for some classical authors, the situation is even far worse. So no, the Bible is still the best attested book from antiquity. Well, yes and no, it's true and untrue. I mean, for some classical authors, the text is indeed a disaster. So you hardly know what's going on in the page because actually the text has been corrupted to that extent. For other classical authors, we know the text fairly well. And there are classical authors for which we have many more manuscripts and many more old manuscripts than for the Greek New Testament in comparison. And of course, it's always tricky to use an argument based on the sort of school playground type of thing that, no, mine is bigger, older, better, greener, or whatever than yours. Right? That never works. I mean, the argument can work when you use it in sort of comparative confidence. For example, we believe that we have the Gallic War of Julius Caesar, even though we have only manuscripts that are quite late. So if we trust that we have the text of Julius Caesar, then we can trust the text of the New Testament because we have older and better evidence for it. So if you use it that way, the argument can work, but not sort of, oh, Bible is the best attested thing that there is. That's a tricky one. But let's give me some positive arguments. We have the 500,000 differences. What's the first observation? I mean, you always start first looking at those things. The first thing is, I'm happy to say, there are no systematic patterns in all those textual variants. And that's an absolute crucial one. So, though there are quite a few textual variants which will affect the meaning of a particular sentence or a particular paragraph, it is not the case that there has been a systematic revision. I mean, the variants simply don't allow to argue for a systematic revision. I mean, I have a colleague, Bart Ehrman, is in North Carolina, and there are very few things I agree with him on. But on this point we agree, so he goes basically saying that New Testament is not that reliable, but he has to admit that all those variants with theological significance, he says, they occur randomly in various textual witnesses. And here it comes. Not at all with the kind of consistency one might expect. This is what he has to admit in his scholarly work. He doesn't repeat it in his popular work, by the way. But there it is. It's not with the sort of consistency you might expect, and if I finish his sentence for him, if the whole thing was deliberate. But if you accept the premise, perhaps it was not that deliberate at all, then the lack of consistency is easy to explain. Take, for example, Mark, the Gospel of Mark, first verse. It starts like this. The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Well, there are quite a few manuscripts which don't have Son of God. Now, that's interesting. Is it the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, or is it the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God? Now, Son of God must be secondary in this sort of line of argument, because there must have been sort of Christians in later ages who were so keen to get sort of Jesus as the Son of God in the books. Well, and here we go for the consistency issue. Only 11 verses later, in Mark chapter 1, we get a voice from heaven saying, "You are my beloved Son." Voice from heaven, well, can only be sort of God up there. Voice coming down, "You are my beloved." Not a single textual variant on that phrase. So that summarizes the thing. Though you can have very meaningful variants in one thing, no, is it the Son of God or not? Has been somebody sort of trying to sex up the Gospel of Mark or sex down? No, there's nothing like that, because a little bit further, everyone had already forgotten about the issue. So that's the first thing. But of course, from all those variants, those 500,000, you can create a set together that is meaningful. And you can create your own sort of pattern out of those. And that is the advantages for many of having so many variants. But the individual variants seem independent of one another. Second, the inconsistent pattern of these variants means at the very least that we have independent lines of transmission of the text. So if you look a little bit, sort of go back to your biology, or perhaps you're doing it at the moment, you get those nice sort of tree of life type of things with it's branching out. But you can do that with manuscripts as well. And if you take the original text sort of as the origin of all manuscripts, then it seems pretty clear that we have many independent lines all going back to the original. And the independent lines of transmission are all there because people made errors in copying, and therefore they separated from other manuscripts, etc. So we have many independent lines. We have multiple witnesses. Even though there are differences, they basically argue all for the same thing. That means that there is no evidence for any control of the text. There was no authority, apparently, given the evidence, given the nature of the evidence, that whipped the text into single shape. Let's put it, how shall I put it? I will come back to that later. Third argument, textual differences can make a huge impact locally. For example, in, again, Mark chapter 1. At one point, Jesus looks around. He stretches out his hand, he wants to heal something. He looks around. And then there are two variants here. The one says, he looks around with compassion. The alternative is, he looks around angrily. Well, that is sort of kind of night and day type of difference, isn't it? Was Jesus angry, or was he filled with compassion? You get quite a different picture of that particular thing. Now here, angry is the minority thing, and people like Bart Ehrman have actually argued, here is another instance of the evil church who tries to smooth out the sort of angry Jesus, because it doesn't fit the sort of picture that the church wants to project. However, inconsistency kicks in again, because a couple of chapters further, in the Gospel of Mark, similar situation, Jesus looks around angrily, without a single variant there. So if somebody tried to sort of brush out an angry Jesus, he didn't do a particularly good job. So that's the sort of thing going on. It is a little bit like if you compare it to a tapestry, if you have such a big tapestry. The image, the overall image the tapestry makes is quite clear. Everyone sees what the picture is. If you take a magnifying glass, then you can suddenly see that some of the individual threads have been removed or are discolored, or there's a little hole in the tapestry. It doesn't make a difference for the overall picture, but it does make a difference if you are studying that particular point. So, the nature of the variation of the text, the nature of those 500,000 differences, and most of them are spelling differences, by the way, but still, for the order of rhetoric, I thought I'll stick with the 500,000. The nature of the variation is a powerful argument to suggest that we have basically the text as it was distributed early on, even though we are not always sure about the exact wording of the text. And I hope you sense the difference here. The message of the text is cut clear. There's no doubt about it. And that's why lots of people in the Faculty of Divinity don't bother with those differences between manuscripts at all, because it doesn't affect their work at the least. I'm a little bit bothered with it, because it's my job, basically. I'm going to show my age. There was a time that we wore wrist watches. Oh, there's still some around. Which were not digital. No, you had to wind them up. And those were the good old days when, if there was only one watch in the room, everyone knew what the time was, because it was the time of that one watch. As soon as there were two watches in the room, nobody knew what the exact time was. Now, start adding a little bit. So, kind of 10, 20, 30, 40 watches. And all of them are a little bit different. Now, an engineer would come up with a solution, just throw them on a big heap and sort of take the average, or whatever. A historian, or in my case, sort of a theologian, would do something more intelligent, of course. They would start to look at sort of how come that all those 5 expensive watches from Switzerland all are almost the exact same time, while those watches made in North Korea are not doing anything at all. Why are all those watches made in England 2 decades behind? That sort of thing. So you can start to use your God-given intelligence to make some intelligent observation. And that is exactly what you do with looking at the whole manuscript edition. Now, in closing, there's one additional historical argument. Christianity started in a sort of underdog position, in the sense that it was not centralized, according to its own record in the New Testament, popular among the lower classes, but not really making an impact on the sort of upper class level. It was spread out, and there was no centralized authority for the first 250 years or so. Now, when you have no central authority and you're spread out all over the Roman Empire and outside, it is impossible to have any centralized rewriting of the text. There was no pope in existence who could order the sort of, okay, from now on, Jesus is God, and let's have all that in Scripture. From the 4th century onwards, Christianity became state religion. And I could almost imagine that from that time on, it was sort of possible. It would still be sort of difficult, but it was sort of possible. The advantage here is that from the 4th century we have already so much physical evidence left that we know that it did not happen then. It was never on the cards. So at the time for which we have not much evidence before the 4th century, it could not happen because the infrastructure wasn't there. From the 4th century, the infrastructure was there, but we know it did not happen then. So, in a sense, yes, it may be a bit rough at places. If you ask me for the correct word order of every sentence in the New Testament, sometimes I throw up my hands in the air and say, yeah, can be this, can be that. But when it comes to the message of every single paragraph, or of the chapter as a whole, or the book of a whole, why was the Gospel of Mark written? Well, with one goal. Namely, to show that the Son of God himself came down to earth to die for people, so that the people could go back to God. That was the sole purpose why the Gospel was written. And that is visible in every chapter of the book. So whether or not he wrote in his first sentence, Jesus Christ, Son of God, or not, it may affect your reading strategy, or it doesn't affect the meaning of the book. Okay, thank you very much for hanging in there.
Great, we're going to have a couple of minutes round tables to discuss what we've heard, so anything you agree with, anything you disagree with, and any questions you might want to ask Dirk during the Q&A. And do text in your questions, keep texting them in, and we'll come back to Q&A in a couple of moments. Great, sorry to break in there, but we're going to start Q&A now, just so we can get through some questions. Brilliant. Great, so we're going to have a mic going round. If anyone wants to ask a question from the floor, you can stick up a hand. Equally, texts will be coming in and I can be reading them out. So anyone want to start us off from the floor? The mic? Okay, I'll kick us off. You mentioned a little bit, Dirk, about the message being the same. And you summarized a bit of the message in Mark. What would you kind of summarize the message of the whole New Testament as?
Ooh, message of the whole New Testament. I think it's best summarized by Paul, and he basically says, at one point, this is what I delivered to you. So he had handed down to you. And that is by which you get saved, if you keep it at least in sort of shape that I've delivered it to you. And it goes on very simple thing, that Jesus died for our sins, according to the scriptures, and he was buried, but that's the evidence for the fact he died, and that he rose again. And I think that is the sort of summary of the New Testament. Jesus died, not just Jesus died, but Jesus died for our sin. So that's the sort of crucial bit, that Jesus died for our sin, and how that worked is another thing. And sometimes that's abbreviated in the New Testament that Jesus died for us, or that's shorthand for Jesus died for our sin. And then the second bit is, and that he rose again. And that is the sort of summary of the whole New Testament, and all the rest is unpacking what sort of effect that has on life, what sort of effect that has on future, etc.
Thank you. So, question here, can some of the differences be explained by redaction? For example, Luke trying to put forward the idea of universal salvation, so more women at the tomb compared to Mark and Matthew. So, i.e., the differences aren't arbitrary and some systematic editing.
Okay, can some of the differences be explained by sort of redaction, kind of an editorial strategy? Well, at least the sort of differences there are between Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are definitely there because those guys wanted to, or they taught the life and death of Jesus in different ways, with different emphases. So some of the differences between the four Gospels are definitely sort of redactional in the sense of wanted to bring out different things, or they remembered it in a different way, or perhaps better, they taught it in a different way. Now, when we are looking at differences between individual manuscripts as the result of a redactional strategy, and then, of course, we are in transmission history rather than in original writing, then, yes, there is one group of manuscripts which has a text of the Book of Acts of all, and I'm not sure why it is the Book of Acts, which is about 10% longer than the regular text. And if you look at all those differences, and they are run from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, there seems to be sort of a systematically different attitude to Israel, a systematically different attitude to women. So there you get a systematically carried out revision from the beginning to the end, contained in a group of manuscripts, and there you see coherence between sort of textual changes. Now, the great thing is, I'm glad it happened at least once in the sort of history of textual transmission, because now I know what to expect. So, if you want to publish your own revised Greek New Testament. How would that look like? Well, have a look at those manuscripts in Acts, and then you can see what it would look like. But that's rather unique. I don't find it anywhere else.
The question about slightly kind of broader apparent inconsistencies. So why is there such an apparent change in God's character from the Old Testament to the New?
Why is such a change between the Old Testament and New in God's character? Well, part of it has to do with selective memory. Jesus talked more about hell than any other character in the New Testament, which is sort of, that's part of our selective memory. New Testament talks about Jesus coming down with a flaming sword, avenging all those people who were persecuting his church. And the Old Testament talks about God in relation to Israel, that as a father I took you up in my arms and I protected you, and when you walked away, it pained my heart. And so part of it is selective memory, that we tend to remember the Old Testament more negative and remember the New Testament a little bit too positive. But frankly, if you give me sufficient time, I can preach you the whole New Testament from the Old without ever sort of needing the New Testament at all. Because ultimately the God behind the two are the same.
Would anyone like to come back on any of those questions, or last question from the floor? Probably only got time for one more question. Great, so Mike over here, please.
Seeing as we know that the New Testaments we have today are similar to the original versions, why should we believe what's actually written in them? Like, for example, just because it was written that Jesus did miracles, why should we believe that he did?
Very good point.
We've got about 2 minutes for this.
So. About 2 minutes. I think you make a very helpful and important distinction between, though the records of it may be reliable, doesn't mean that what they are describing is actually true or reliable or trustworthy. Well, in a sense, that is a completely different ballpark of the question I had today. I could give two answers. One of them is historical plausibility, but those are all rather rational arguments, and plenty of books written on that issue. The other one is one of personal testimony. In a sense, yes, I'm not sure about your situation, but it has been my personal experience that actually, believing that what I am studying is actually true is something that seems to be confirmed, not some internal feeling, but also in what the world is like. It explains the world, it explains some other people's emotions, it explains evil, it explains good, it explains suffering much better than anything else. And it is that personal experience which I think confirms for me, yes, no, I dare to put my life on this. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. That's all we've got time for, so thank you so much, Dirk. But there were some more questions texted in just at the end there, so do keep chatting around tables, and Dirk will be around afterwards as well, and he'd love to chat more, so ask him those questions. So I'm going to have to wrap up, but really at lunchtime can only scratch the surface. It's such a big question, and please don't make this the last time that you think about this topic. So there's some resources at the back there which are free for you to take away to help you think more about this. So one of them is just quite a small booklet, Can We Trust What the Gospels Say About Jesus? I found it really helpful in just summarizing some of the key bits of evidence for that. And if you want to kind of go a little bit more in depth, a bit more academic, this one, the New Testament documents, are they reliable? So make the most of those, it'd be great to use them. But actually one of the best ways of looking into it is to read one of the accounts for yourself. So we've got these copies of Luke's account on your tables. Luke really does speak for himself. You don't need to be told what it means. So just take it away, read it, and maybe ask yourself 3 questions as you read. So the first one, what does Luke say about who Jesus is? Secondly, what does Luke say about why he came? And thirdly, if it's true, and I know that's a big if, so do use those resources at the back to flesh that one out. But if it is true, how would my life be different? So who is Jesus? Why did he come? How would it change my life? So yeah, really do take them away. It won't take you long. It's not a very long book. So if you do want to chat more about this with someone else, though, because it's much more fun doing this sort of thing with people, check the I'm interested box on the feedback cards that you'll see on your tables. Someone from the Christian Union will get in touch with you. And also we'd love to know if there's anything we can make any way we can make the questions better. So just give us some feedback. We'd love that. So yeah, basically, I just really love to encourage you to look into it more. It's so worth it. So don't leave it here this lunchtime. So for now, there's going to be snacks coming out at our tables. So if you don't have to rush off, do stay chatting. Chat to Dirk afterwards as well. Have a great week. See you here next week.